This video is designed to bring you peace and serenity, helping you unwind and let go of the day's worries. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where are you tuning in from? What city are you in right now? And what time is it as you press play? Make sure to subscribe to the channel, settle into a cozy spot, and let yourself drift into a calm, soothing state. But as you relax, keep this in mind. Sometimes the calmest moments hide the most unexpected surprises. Ready? Let's begin. I can't shake the feeling of unease in my own home. It's been weeks since it happened, but the echoes of that day still cling to me, creeping into my thoughts when I least expect it. I keep going over every detail, trying to understand what went wrong. But no matter how much I think about it, I can't piece it together. It was just a regular Saturday morning. The house was quiet, peacefully so. I was sipping my coffee and enjoying the rare silence before heading out to run errands. My husband, Mark, was out of town for work, and our daughter, Lily, was staying at a friend's house for the night. I remember feeling grateful for a few moments of solitude, completely unaware that it would all shatter within seconds. It started with a sound, Mark's voice, clear as day, calling me from the backyard. "Claire, come here, quick. I need you." My heart jolted. Mark wasn't supposed to be home for another 3 days. Could he have returned early? Was he in trouble? Without a second thought, I rushed to the back door. When I flung it open, the yard was still, empty, and eerily quiet. My breath hitched. Had I imagined it? But it felt so real, too real. Just as I began to question my sanity, his voice came again, this time sharper and more urgent. "Claire, hurry. I'm hurt." It was coming from beyond the fence, in the dense woods that bordered our property. Fear mixed with adrenaline as I scrambled over the fence and pushed through the trees, calling his name. "Mark, where are you?" His reply came quickly, but it seemed off, like it was bouncing between the trees. "Over here. Hurry, I need you." I kept moving, my mind racing with horrible possibilities, but the further I went, the stranger it became. His voice kept shifting, coming from different directions, drawing me deeper into the forest. The woods grew darker, the air heavier with every step I took. The light filtering through the trees became dim and cold, as if the forest itself wanted to keep me out or trap me in. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing and froze in place. A massive sinkhole stretched before me, the ground falling away into an abyss so deep that I couldn't see the bottom. I stared, my chest tightening. How had I never known this was here? Before I could process it, a scream pierced the air, Lily's voice, raw with terror. "Mom, help me." My heart felt like it stopped. It was coming from the pit. I inched closer, peering into the darkness. "Lily," I shouted. "Where are you?" "Down here. I can't climb out," she sobbed. My instincts screamed at me to jump in, but the pit's sheer walls were smooth, with no way down. Frantically, I searched for something to help me descend. Then my mother's voice joined the cries. She called my name softly, lovingly, from the depths of the sinkhole. "Claire, come down. It's okay, we need you." I stumbled backward, panic flooding my mind. My mother had been dead for years. What was happening? The voices became a chorus, overlapping and growing more desperate. Mark, Lily, my mother, they all called to me, begging, pleading, accusing. "Why won't you help us? You're leaving us here to die." The sheer wrongness of it made my head spin. For a moment, I almost believed them. Almost. But as I leaned closer to the edge, I saw it. something shifting in the shadows at the bottom of the pit. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement, but then I saw it clearly. It wasn't human. A wave of pure terror slammed into me. Whatever it wasn't my family. It couldn't be. I staggered backward, tripping over roots as the voices turned to guttural growls and angry howls. My mind screamed for me to run, and I obeyed, tearing through the woods as fast as my legs would carry me. Branches scratched at my face, thorns ripped at my clothes, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The voices pursued me, their tone shifting from pleas to accusations, filled with an otherworldly rage. Finally, I burst out of the forest and collapsed into my yard, gasping for breath. The world around me felt too normal, birds chirping, the distant hum of a lawnmower, the faint laughter of children playing. But I couldn't stop trembling. Hours later, Mark came home to find me huddled on the couch, every door and window locked. I tried to explain, but how could I? How do you tell someone you were almost lured to your death by the voices of those you love? Since then, I've been researching. I've read stories of people being tricked by familiar voices, of dark entities that mimic loved ones to lure their victims into traps. Some call them demons, others say they're spirits of the forest. I don't know what to believe. All I know is that something was in those woods, and it wanted me. I haven't gone back there since, and I'm not sure I ever will. Mark has suggested moving, but I wonder, would it even matter? Or would it just follow me? The worst part is the doubt. What if, somehow, my family really was down there? What if I left them behind? Logic tells me it's impossible, but the guilt still eats away at me. I listen carefully now to every sound, every call of my name, because I know it's not over. It was meant to be just another peaceful getaway. My friend Eric and I had planned a weekend deep in the mountains, a routine camping trip filled with hiking and gazing at the stars. We'd done it many times before without a hitch, but this time something was different. We ventured farther than ever, pushing into the dense wilderness. The trail grew fainter as we climbed higher, the forest pressing in around us. By the time we realized how far we had gone, the sun was already sinking below the horizon. We had misjudged the distance back to our campsite, and the thick canopy of trees devoured the last light of the day. The darkness fell fast, quicker than either of us expected, wrapping us in a suffocating blackness. Eric suggested we set up camp right where we were, to avoid stumbling blindly through the woods. I reluctantly agreed. Navigating in total darkness seemed like an unnecessary risk. We found a small clearing, just large enough for our tent, and began unpacking. That's when I saw it, a flicker of light. It was faint, barely more than a speck, but unmistakable. It hovered between the trees, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. "Eric," I whispered, nudging him and pointing toward the glow. "Do you see that?" He squinted into the distance. "Weird. Probably a firefly." But it wasn't. The light grew stronger, pulsating softly like a heartbeat. Its golden hue illuminated the surrounding trees, casting long, eerie shadows. There was something unnervingly beautiful about it, like it was calling to me. Without thinking, I took a step toward it. "Whoa, where are you going?" Eric grabbed my arm, his voice sharp. I blinked, snapping out of the trance. I don't know. It felt like it wanted me to follow it. Eric's brow furrowed, his unease palpable. "Let's just focus on the tent, okay? Whatever that is, we'll figure it out in the morning." I nodded, but my eyes kept drifting back to the light. It hovered there, swaying gently as if waiting. The more I stared, the more it seemed alive, sentient even. We managed to pitch the tent, But before we could even relax, another light appeared. This one was blue, colder and sharper, floating higher than the first. Then a third emerged, pink, soft and mesmerizing. The three lights began to weave and dance around each other, forming a hypnotic display that surrounded us. "Eric," I whispered, my voice trembling. "There's more of them." He was already staring, his face pale. "What? Are they?" The lights multiplied, appearing in every direction, forming a shimmering circle around the clearing. They pulsed in unison, their glow casting a surreal light on the forest floor. I felt it again, that pull. It was stronger now, almost impossible to resist. "They're trying to lead us somewhere," I said, my voice barely audible. Maybe they can help us find our way back." Eric grabbed my shoulders, shaking me. "Are you insane? Those things aren't natural. We're staying here until morning." But I couldn't look away. The lights felt safe, inviting. I took a step toward the nearest one, an amber orb that seemed to brighten in response, like it was encouraging me. Eric's voice sounded distant, drowned out by the hum that now filled the air, low and rhythmic, vibrating in my chest. Before I knew it, I was walking. The lights moved with me, forming a glowing path through the trees. I heard Eric shouting behind me, his footsteps crunching on the forest floor as he tried to keep up, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The lights were guiding me, showing me the way. Time lost all meaning as I followed their hypnotic dance deeper into the forest. Eventually, the trees thinned, and I stepped into a clearing unlike anything I'd ever seen. The lights spread out, forming a perfect circle around the open space. In the center was something, a black void, a pit that seemed to absorb all light and sound. The hum grew louder, more insistent, as if urging me forward. I froze at the edge of the pit, staring into the darkness. It wasn't just empty, it was alive, shifting and writhing like a mass of shadowy tendrils. A voice, faint but clear, echoed in my mind. "Come closer." I leaned forward, my body moving against my will. The lights pulsed faster, their rhythm syncing with the pounding of my heart. Just as I was about to step into the void, Eric tackled me from behind, pulling me to the ground. "Snap out of it," he shouted, his voice cutting through the fog in my mind. "What the hell are you doing?" I blinked, the trance broken. The lights were gone, and the clearing was just a patch of dirt and rocks. The pit, the void, it had vanished as if it were never there. Eric hauled me to my feet, his hands trembling. "We're leaving now," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. We stumbled through the forest, the night stretching endlessly around us. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, and every sound made my heart race. When we finally reached our campsite at dawn, we packed up in silence and hiked out as fast as we could. Eric refuses to talk about that night. As for me, I've tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion or a trick of the mind, but deep down, I know better. Sometimes late at night, I'll catch a faint glow outside my window or hear the low hum in the distance. I keep the lights on and the curtains drawn, praying that whatever was out there in the woods stays far away. But I can't shake the feeling that the lights are still waiting, calling, and one day they'll find me again. I headed out for work just like any other morning, but the moment I stepped outside, I knew something was terribly wrong. The street was unnervingly quiet, no cars, no people, not even the usual hum of life. The sky was painted with a strange, murky orange hue, almost like the aftermath of a fire, and the air was thick with an acrid, metallic scent. I tried convincing myself it was just some freak weather event, but deep down, I felt an unshakable dread. As I made my way down the eerily empty street, I heard a voice calling my name. It sounded like my dad's, calm, familiar, reassuring, but something wasn't right. There was a distortion in the tone, a hollow reverberation that sent chills down my spine. Against every instinct, I didn't answer. I just kept walking, ignoring the growing urgency in the voice as it shifted to pleading, then almost sobbing. After what felt like hours of wandering the deserted cityscape, I stumbled across a diner. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, flickering between open and closed, but the building looked otherwise untouched. Hunger clawed at me, so I stepped inside. The interior was unsettlingly pristine, tables neatly set, the jukebox humming softly with a tune I didn't recognize. But when I reached for a cup of coffee on the counter, I froze. The liquid inside wasn't coffee at all. It was black and viscous, swirling as if alive. My gut screamed at me to leave, so I backed away and exited, my stomach empty but my sense of dread heavier than ever. Outside, I noticed a faint beam of light on the horizon, cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. It looked warm and inviting, like the sun breaking through after a storm. For a moment, I felt hope. But then I heard a whisper, a raspy, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the light itself. "Come closer," it murmured. The voice was almost hypnotic, but something primal within me screamed it. I turned away and forced myself to walk in the opposite direction, though every step felt like a betrayal of my instincts. The further I went, the stranger the world became. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, their movements too deliberate to be tricks of the light. And then I saw them, figures emerging from the darkness. They were impossibly tall, their silhouettes humanoid but stretched and distorted, as if reality itself couldn't contain them. Their heads were featureless voids, yet I felt their gaze sear into me. Most chilling were their hands, which ended in impossibly long fingers that twitched as if eager to grasp something. I forced my eyes down and kept walking, pretending I hadn't seen them. Time was meaningless here. My watch had stopped, and the sky never changed, its sickly glow unyielding. Exhaustion began to creep in, a heaviness in my limbs that begged me to stop, to rest. But I couldn't. I knew that if I paused, even for a moment, I'd be unable to start again. I pushed on, each step a battle against the fatigue threatening to consume me. The world around me twisted and shifted without warning. One moment, I was walking through what looked like my old neighborhood, complete with the swing set from my childhood backyard. The next, I was in a dense forest. The trees towering and ancient, their bark bleeding in dark, tar-like substance. I couldn't make sense of any of it, and the randomness only deepened my panic. At some point, I became aware of whispers, soft, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each step. They spoke in a language I didn't recognize, the words sharp and grating. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling my head until I thought it might split open. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. They were inside me. Then, as suddenly as they started, the whispers stopped. I opened my eyes to find myself standing before a massive gate made of blackened iron. It towered above me, its surface etched with symbols that shifted and writhed as I stared at them. I didn't want to go through, but the ground behind me had disappeared, replaced by an endless void. With no other choice, I pushed the gate open. Beyond it was a vast, open plain, the ground cracked and dry like a desert. At the center stood a colossal monolith, its surface glowing faintly with an inner light. I felt drawn to it, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to run the other way. As I approached, I realized the light wasn't coming from the monolith itself, but from within it. Shapes moved inside, figures too horrific to describe, their forms shifting and merging like shadows on water. And then, the monolith began to hum. The sound was low and resonant, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. It grew louder, more intense, until it was all I could hear, all I could feel. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the world around me dissolved into darkness. When I woke, I was lying on my front porch, the morning sun warming my face. Everything seemed normal, the birds chirping, cars passing by. But my clothes were torn and filthy, and my body ached as if I'd run for miles. I stumbled inside and caught my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes hollow, and there was something else, something written on my arm, faint but unmistakable. It was one of the symbols from the gate. To this day, I don't know what happened to me or how I survived. But I know one thing, I was tested. And if anyone else ever finds themselves in that place, remember this: trust nothing, speak to no one, and no matter what, keep moving. It's the only way out. For over 20 years, I've delved into the paranormal, exploring the mysteries that exist at the edges of human understanding. But nothing could have braced me for what I uncovered about silence and its connection to something far more sinister, perhaps even the infernal. What started as an innocuous experiment spiraled into an unrelenting nightmare, one that changed everything I thought I knew. It all began when I started studying the effects of sensory deprivation. At first, the results were what you'd expect: elevated anxiety, hallucinations brought on by isolation, and the eerie tricks the mind plays when deprived of stimuli. However, the deeper I went, the more unsettling the patterns became. The faint murmurs, like whispers carried on an invisible wind, the skin-crawling sensation of being watched, and the weighty sense of dread that settled over me like a thick fog. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to my mind reacting to prolonged silence. But the oddities didn't stop, they grew. Determined to understand the strange occurrences, I turned to history. Monastic texts spoke of monks who, during vows of silence, claimed to see terrifying visions of otherworldly torment. Prisoners locked in isolation recounted shadowy figures and whispers from nowhere. Even my own test subjects described progressively horrifying experiences: shadows moving when no one was there, faint cries echoing from the void, and overwhelming senses of despair. It became clear there was something uniquely horrifying about silence, and that opened a door to places I didn't yet understand. My research led me to ancient writings, cryptic notes in religious texts, and occult manuscripts. They referenced silence as a veil, a fragile boundary between our world and another, darker realm. There were chilling accounts claiming that noise shields us, keeping unspeakable forces at bay. If true, then silence wasn't just emptiness, it was exposure, a tearing away of that protective barrier. Desperate for answers, I decided to test the theory on myself. For 1 week, I would eliminate all unnecessary sound from my life. No music, no television, no small talk. The first day passed uneventfully, almost pleasantly, as I adjusted to the stillness. On the second day, though, the atmosphere shifted. It began with faint whispers just on the edge of my hearing, like someone murmuring a secret I wasn't meant to hear. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, slipping away the moment I turned to look. By the third day, the silence felt oppressive, like a living thing pressing against my chest. My reflection in the mirror started to change, just subtle shifts at first. My eyes seemed darker, my features sharper, and at times, it felt like my reflection lingered a second too long after I moved. The whispers grew louder that night, almost forming words, though in no language I could recognize. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By day 4, the presence was undeniable. My surroundings seemed distorted. Shadows stretched impossibly long, claw-like shapes darted through darkened corners. I swear I saw glowing, blood-red eyes staring at me from the darkness of my closet. And the whispers, they weren't whispers anymore. They were screams, demonic laughter, and voices calling my name in guttural tones that made my blood run cold. Yet, as horrifying as it was, I couldn't stop. I had to know what was on the other side of the silence. On the 5th night, when the terror had reached its peak, I had a revelation. The chaos wasn't entirely external. My thoughts, my fear, were amplifying the darkness, feeding it. I forced myself to sit in absolute stillness, quieting not just the noise around me but the noise within me. It wasn't easy. My mind rebelled against the emptiness, but slowly I silenced it all. And then the world shifted. The whispers stopped. The shadows receded. For the first time in days, I felt peace, as if I'd sealed a crack in reality itself. But as the calm settled in, I realized something terrifying. I hadn't banished the entities. They were still there, watching from beyond the veil. I had simply removed the invitation. I stayed in that state of inner silence for the rest of the week, and nothing returned. When the experiment ended, I emerged changed, but not unscathed. The memory of those creatures, the way they lurked just beyond the edge of perception, will never leave me. I've come to believe that what we call silence is a double-edged sword. True silence, both external and internal, can protect us. But incomplete silence, when we quiet our surroundings but not our minds, draws them closer, like moths to a flame. Since then, I've dedicated myself to mastering what I call the stillness shield. By cultivating inner quiet, I've helped others find peace and protection from the darkness. But there are moments, especially in times of stress, when I feel them again, watching, waiting for a crack in the silence, a moment of weakness. That's why I'm sharing this story. In a world drowning in noise, we've forgotten the power and danger of silence. If you ever attempt to explore it, be prepared. True silence can reveal incredible truths about yourself, but it might also reveal the horrors that lurk just beyond the veil. So if you hear whispers in the quiet or catch a glimpse of something in the corner of your eye, don't look, don't listen, and above all, don't let the silence consume you. Our team included me, Sergeant Rodriguez, our local guide Otto, and 3 fellow soldiers. The trek to the secluded mountain village felt heavy with an inexplicable tension, as though the very air was trying to warn us. When we arrived, silence blanketed the place. No laughter, no livestock, just the soft whistling of wind through empty homes. The first signs of unease hit hard. It seemed as if life had been abruptly halted. Plates with uneaten food were still on tables. A child's toy truck lay abandoned in the dirt. Front doors swung open as if the occupants had fled in haste. Yet there were no bodies, no blood, no clues to suggest a violent event. The entire village had simply ceased to exist as a community. We split into pairs to search the buildings, but every home told the same story. Half-finished chores, forgotten belongings, a life interrupted. In one kitchen, a kettle whistled faintly on a dying fire. It was unnervingly fresh, as if someone had been there only moments before. As the sun dipped below the peaks, the atmosphere shifted. Shadows grew unnaturally long, seeming to creep toward us. I caught fleeting glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision, but when I turned, nothing was there. Then came the sounds. At first, it was faint murmurs, almost indistinguishable from the wind. But the murmurs grew louder, evolving into an unsettling cacophony of clicks and hisses. It was a language, but not one meant for human ears. We gathered in the village square, visibly shaken. Otto, our guide, pulled me aside. "There are rules here," he said in a hushed voice, his eyes darting around nervously. "Old rules. If we want to leave this place alive, we must follow them." "What rules?" I demanded, my voice barely steady. Otto's voice dropped even lower. "Never look up at the cliffs after dark. Never acknowledge voices calling your name from the shadows. And most importantly, do not respond if something speaks to you in a familiar voice." Before I could press him further, a scream tore through the night. It was raw, agonized. and it came from the far side of the village. Sergeant James barked orders. Davis and Carter, with me. The rest of you hold the perimeter. They vanished into the darkness, leaving the rest of us clutching our weapons, nerves frayed. The minutes stretched into eternity. The whispers became louder, almost conversational, as if mocking us. The air itself seemed heavier, pressing down on us. Then James stumbled back into view, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "They've got Carter," he stammered. "I don't know what they are, but we need to get out. Now." We tried to retreat, but the village had changed. Paths looped back on themselves, leading us in circles. Landmarks seemed to shift when we looked away. The more we tried to navigate, the more we realized we were trapped in some sort of labyrinthine nightmare. As the night wore on, our flashlights began to flicker. Shapes moved in the periphery of our vision. They were humanoid but wrong, too tall, too thin, their movements jerky and unnatural. Occasionally, a face would appear in a window, vanishing the moment we looked directly at it. The whispers turned to mocking laughter. At some point, I became separated from the group. I found myself in a narrow alley, my flashlight barely functional. That's when I heard it, a soft, melodic humming. It was a tune my mother used to sing when I was a child. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen. Slowly, I turned. At the end of the alley stood a figure. It appeared childlike, but as I raised my dimming light, I saw its grotesque proportions. Its limbs were elongated, its head tilted unnaturally. The face was a mockery of humanity, features distorted as if they had been stretched and rearranged by cruel hands. Its eyes. They weren't eyes at all, just dark voids that seemed to pull the light from the air. I don't remember much after that. When I woke, I was alone on the mountain's edge, miles from the village. They told me I'd been gone for 4 days. Search teams combed the area but found nothing. No village, no auto, no team. The official report blamed insurgents and stress-induced hallucinations. But I know what I experienced. In the darkest hours of the night, I still hear the whispers and see those twisted forms lurking in the shadows of my mind. To anyone who finds themselves in an abandoned place where the silence feels alive, take my advice. Leave. Don't linger. Don't investigate. And whatever you do, don't turn around if you hear someone call your name. Some things are better left undiscovered, their secrets buried in the dark where they belong. At sunrise, our group of 6 set out into the dense rainforest, our movements slow and deliberate. The air was stifling, thick with humidity, and the heat clung to us like a second skin. Sweat poured down my face, and as we delved deeper, an inexplicable sense of unease gnawed at the edges of my mind. The jungle seemed unnaturally quiet, as though it were listening. Hours passed as we trudged through the tangled vegetation. Then, out of nowhere, we stumbled into an open glade, a strange and unexpected clearing. The air here felt colder, despite the oppressive climate. I shivered involuntarily. Something was off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. The trees encircling the clearing were warped and unnatural. Their twisted trunks coiled like snakes. Their gnarled branches stretched out like skeletal hands, casting bizarre, distorted shadows on the ground. As we ventured further in and noticed peculiar patterns etched into the bark, spirals and symbols that seemed almost deliberate. They weren't random. Anyone else feel that? Carter whispered, gripping his rifle tightly. His voice was barely audible, yet it carried an edge of fear. Before I could answer, my eyes caught something, a face, embedded in one of the tree trunks, unmistakably human. My breath hitched. I blinked hard, hoping I was imagining it. But when I looked again, it was still there. The features were contorted, the mouth frozen mid-scream, eyes shut tight. "Guys, look at this," I managed to say, my voice trembling. The others turned to where I was pointing, and their expressions shifted from confusion to horror. All around us, faces began to emerge from the bark. Some were anguished, their mouths wide open as if silently screaming. Others appeared serene, almost peaceful. The faces seemed alive, as though they were watching us, waiting for something. Panic rippled through our group as more faces appeared, their eyes slowly opening. The sense of being watched became suffocating. I reached for the radio, but all I got was static. The compass spun wildly, and even our GPS units displayed nothing but garbled nonsense. It was as if we'd been cut off from the world entirely. The soldiers accompanying us muttered nervously in a language I couldn't understand. One of them, his face pale with terror, turned to me. "We cannot leave," he said, his broken English thick with dread. "Not until we are chosen." "Chosen for what?" Carter snapped, his voice rising. The soldier shook his head, unwilling or unable to explain. The faces in the trees grew more vivid, their eyes locking onto ours with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When we tried to leave the clearing, every path led us back to the center, as though the forest itself had come alive to trap us. The air seemed heavier now, almost pressing down on us. Time lost all meaning. The sun hung motionless in the sky, casting a pale, sickly light that never shifted. Carter was the first to snap. After hours, or perhaps days, of the unrelenting gaze of the faces, he let out a guttural scream and began firing wildly into the trees. The sharp crack of gunfire shattered the eerie stillness, but it accomplished nothing. Then it began. A sound, high-pitched and inhuman, erupted from all around us, as if the forest itself was screaming. There was a sound of pure rage, a deafening wail that made the ground tremble. The trees started to move. Their trunks writhed like living creatures, and their branches lashed out, clawing at us. Chaos erupted. I saw Carter get snatched by a vine, his scream cut short as he was dragged into the trees. The others were scattered, their cries mingling with the unearthly wailing. I fought to free myself as vines coiled around my legs, pulling me down. Desperation fueled me, and I managed to slash through the tendrils with my knife. In the midst of the chaos, I saw an opening, a narrow gap in the thrashing trees. Without thinking, I bolted, running faster than I ever thought possible. Branches swiped at me, vines reached for my ankles, but somehow I made it through. Suddenly, I was back in the jungle, the normal jungle. The deafening sound stopped abruptly, replaced by the hum of insects and the distant calls of birds. I spun around, expecting to see the clearing, faces, the nightmare, but there was nothing. Just trees, ordinary and still. Disoriented and gasping for breath, I staggered back toward the base. When I finally made contact, the team there insisted we'd only been out of communication for a few hours, but my torn clothing and the scratches on my skin told a different story. No trace of the clearing was ever found, and my team was never seen again. Officially, they're listed as MIA, but I know what I saw. I know what happened. Even now, years later, I can't forget. I wake up in the dead of night, haunted by the memory of those faces staring at me, and whenever I pass a gnarled tree, I catch myself looking too closely at the bark, half expecting to see a face emerging, watching, waiting. Whatever that place was, it wasn't meant to be found. And I pray no one else ever stumbles upon it. Because if they do, they may not be among the lucky few who are chosen to escape. It was a night I'll never forget. I was on duty with Carter, scanning the horizon for anything unusual. The ocean was eerily still, like a sheet of glass, reflecting the pale light of a full moon. The air was heavy with an unnatural silence, broken only by the faint creaking of the ship. Around 2 a.m., I spotted something in the distance, a disturbance in the water, too large to be a wave or a passing vessel. "Carter, you see that?" I called out, my voice low but urgent. He squinted into the darkness, his face tightening as he focused on the anomaly. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. We both froze as a massive shape began to rise from the depths. At first, I thought it might be a whale, but this thing kept growing, towering above the water like a living skyscraper. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It was impossible, nothing that large could exist. But Carter saw it too. "We need to alert the captain," he whispered, his voice trembling. Before either of us could move, the creature turned toward our ship. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it was aware of us. It began gliding through the water with an unsettling grace, its enormous form cutting through the waves effortlessly. I grabbed the radio, my hands shaking. "Bridge, this is Starboard Watch. We've got a situation out here. There's some kind of massive creature approaching the ship. I know how this sounds, but you need to see this now." There was a long pause before the bridge responded, their confusion evident. By then, other crew members had gathered on deck, drawn by the commotion. Everyone fell silent as the creature came into full view. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, vaguely humanoid, with glowing patches beneath its translucent skin. Its head alone was the size of our ship, and its eyes, each one larger than a car, seemed to pierce through us, studying us with an unnerving intelligence. The temperature dropped suddenly, so sharply that frost began forming on the railings. Several crew members started panicking, shouting about sea monsters and the end of the world. I couldn't blame them. I was on the verge of losing it myself. The creature circled our ship, maintaining a distance of about 100 yards, close enough to make its presence felt but not close enough to capsize us. They made no aggressive moves, just watched us with those enormous, unreadable eyes. Then things took a turn for the worse. Some of the crew members began acting strangely, their eyes glazed over as if in a trance. They started walking toward the railings, seemingly intent on jumping overboard. We had to physically restrain them to keep them from leaping into the freezing water. I tried to radio for help, but all our communication systems were dead. Not even the emergency channels worked. We were completely isolated, cut off from the world. For hours, the creature circled us, its presence casting a suffocating dread over the ship. No one dared speak above a whisper. The cold seeped into my bones, and I've never felt so small, so powerless in my life. Here we were, a state-of-the-art vessel armed to the teeth, utterly at the mercy of this incomprehensible leviathan. As dawn began to break, the creature finally sank back beneath the waves, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The temperature slowly returned to normal, but the crew remained in shock, unable to fully process what we'd just witnessed. "Tell me you all saw that too," Carter said, breaking the silence. "Tell me I'm not losing my mind." There were shaky nods all around. This was no mass hallucination, whatever that thing was. it had been real. When our communications came back online, we radioed for support and medical evacuation. Several crew members were suffering from hypothermia and shock. Back at port, we were debriefed and sworn to secrecy. They subjected us to a battery of psychological and medical tests, but no one could explain what we encountered. The officials dismissed it as a shared delusion, a product of stress and isolation. But I know what I saw. That thing was real, and it was intelligent. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that we glimpsed something ancient and powerful, something that was never meant to be seen by human eyes. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, those enormous eyes haunting my dreams. I've tried to move on, but a part of me is always watching the ocean, searching for any sign of disturbance in the waves. Because now I know what's out there, lurking in the depths. And I'll never feel truly safe on the water again. The experience changed me. I've become obsessed with marine biology and deep-sea exploration, searching for any clues about what we encountered. I've connected with others online who claim to have had similar experiences in remote parts of the ocean. Most people dismiss them as crazies or attention seekers, but I know better now. There are things out there beyond our understanding. Sometimes I wonder if the creature revealed itself to us intentionally. Was it a warning, a test, or simply curiosity about the strange creatures sailing across its domain? I'll probably never know the truth, but I do know that I'll carry the memory of that night with me forever. The night I came face to face with something truly alien right here on Earth. The night I realized how little we really know about the world around us and how vulnerable we truly are. If you're reading this, you probably think I'm making it all up. I wish I were, but I swear on everything I hold dear, this is the truth. I don't expect you to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't lived through it. All I can say is this: the next time you're out on the open ocean, take a good, long look into those dark waters. Ask yourself what's really down there, watching us from below, and pray you never find out. It was supposed to be a straightforward scouting mission. Reports had come in about a strange string of disappearances involving soldiers near the outskirts of a remote settlement in Ukraine. Miller and I were assigned to investigate. We had been through thick and thin together, countless missions, countless close calls. I trusted him with my life. If only I'd known it would be the last mission we'd ever embark on together. We arrived at the settlement as the evening shadows stretched long across the ground. The place felt like a ghost town. No lights flickered in the windows, no voices or footsteps echoed along the cracked stone streets. An unsettling stillness filled the air, heavy and unnatural. "I don't like this," Miller muttered under his breath, gripping his rifle tighter. His words mirrored my own unease, a feeling like unseen eyes were observing us from the darkness. "Let's make this quick." We decided to split up to cover the area faster, staying in contact via radio. I headed toward an old barn at the edge of the village while Miller moved toward the central square. The barn was empty save for some decaying hay and a chilling draft that seemed to seep into my bones. That's when his voice crackled through my earpiece. "Reed, you need to see this. Central Square. Now." His tone sent a shiver down my spine. I sprinted across the empty streets, my boots echoing like gunshots against the silence. When I rounded the corner, I froze in horror. In the middle of the square lay the body of a soldier, what was left of it. The corpse was grotesquely desiccated, the skin sunken and stretched tight over brittle bones. It was as if every drop of moisture, every ounce of life, had been drained away. But what struck me most was the expression, a mask of sheer terror, as if the man had faced something beyond comprehension. "What the hell did this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Before Miller could respond, a piercing, inhuman shriek ripped through the air. It was a sound I'll never forget, raw, feral, and filled with malice. We spun around, weapons raised, and that's when I saw it. Emerging from the shadows was a creature that defied reason. Its shape was vaguely humanoid, but that's where the similarities ended. Its limbs were unnaturally elongated, twisting at grotesque angles. The pale, almost translucent skin revealed a web of dark, pulsating veins underneath. But the eyes, those eyes glowed an ominous blood red, filled with a hunger that made my stomach churn. The creature moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, lunging straight for Miller. He managed to fire off a few shots, but they seemed to do nothing. The creature tackled him, its unnaturally sharp teeth sinking into his neck. His screams, God, his screams, will haunt me forever. I fired every round I had, finally driving the creature back into the shadows with a guttural howl. Blood soaked the ground as I dropped to Miller's side, trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me, Miller," I begged, my hands trembling as I applied pressure to the wound. But as I looked into his eyes, my stomach twisted. A faint red glow began to flicker in his pupils, the same unnatural light I'd seen in the creature. I don't feel right," he gasped, his voice weak but laced with panic. Then I saw it. His wound was closing on its own, the flesh knitting together in a way that no human body should. "We need to get you out of here," he said, trying to pull him to his feet, but he pushed me away, his strength already unnervingly inhuman. "No, Reed, you don't understand. I can feel it, changing me. You have to stop this before I become like that thing." I shook my head, refusing to accept what was happening. "We'll figure it out, Miller. I'm not leaving you." But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd already lost him. We barricaded ourselves in an old chapel as night fell, the wooden doors creaking with every gust of wind. I stayed up, watching over Miller as his transformation continued. His skin grew paler, the veins beneath it darkening into a grotesque web. His bones cracked and shifted, his body contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. And his eyes. The red glow burned brighter, piercing through the dim light of the single candle I'd managed to light. By dawn, he was barely recognizable. His voice, distorted and guttural, broke the silence. "It's almost time," he rasped, his glowing eyes locking onto mine. "You know what you have to do." Tears streamed down my face as I shook my head. "I can't. Don't ask me to do this." "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't want to become that. Don't let me hurt anyone else." I wanted to believe there was another way, but as the sun's first rays crept through the cracked stained glass, I knew there wasn't. With trembling hands, I gathered every piece of wood and fabric I could find, piling it around him. He didn't resist, only nodding in silent agreement. "I'm sorry," I whispered, striking a match. The fire roared to life, consuming the chapel as I stumbled out into the square. His screams, both human and inhuman, echoed in my ears as I collapsed to my knees, watching the flames climb higher. By the time a rescue team found me hours later, the chapel was nothing but ash. I told them it was an accident, a mission gone wrong. Who would believe the truth? Sometimes even I don't believe it. But I'll never forget what I saw that night, where the sound of Miller's screams turning into something monstrous. If you ever find yourself in the remote villages of Ukraine, heed my warning, some places are cursed, and some horrors are better left buried. It was meant to be just another routine patrol. Another day maintaining order in the rugged terrain of the Carpathian Mountains. There were 5 of us, me, Alvarez, Carter, Ramirez, and Thompson. We'd been a team for nearly a year, and I trusted these men with my life. The morning began like any other, gearing up, checking our equipment, and heading out into the dense, mist-shrouded forests. The air was sharp, carrying the faint scent of pine, and a thin veil of fog clung to the trees, giving the woods an eerie, almost otherworldly feel. For the first 2 hours, everything was calm. Too calm. The forest was unnaturally silent, as if the wildlife itself was holding its breath. Then we stumbled upon something that made my stomach churn. In a small clearing, the mangled remains of a deer lay sprawled across the forest floor. This wasn't just a kill, it was a massacre. The animal had been ripped apart with a ferocity I'd never seen before. Its entrails were strewn in every direction, and the ground was slick with blood. The carcass was still warm, steam rising from the torn flesh. "What the hell did this?" Carter whispered, his voice trembling. I'd seen my share of predator kills, but this was different. This wasn't the work of a wolf or a bear. The sheer brutality of it was unnatural, almost deliberate. "We need to report this," Ramirez said, already reaching for his radio. But before he could make the call, a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. It wasn't coming from one direction, it seemed to surround us, vibrating in the air like a warning. My skin prickled, and I instinctively raised my rifle. "Form up." I barked, and the team moved into a tight defensive circle, weapons trained outward. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, with a deafening roar, the creature erupted from the underbrush. It was massive, a hulking, snarling beast with matted fur the color of ash. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its claws looked like they could shred steel. It moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance between us in seconds. The thing went straight for Carter. He managed to fire off a few shots, but they barely seemed to graze it. With a sickening crunch, the creature clamped its jaws around his torso and shook him like a rag doll. We opened fire, the sound of gunfire deafening in the confined space, but our bullets seemed to do little more than anger it. The beast dropped Carter's limp body and turned its attention to the rest of us. What followed was chaos. We scattered, trying to avoid its razor-sharp claws and snapping jaws. I remember the heat of its breath, the stench of decay that clung to it, and the way its growls seemed to reverberate in my chest. It was impossibly fast, almost as if it were toying with us. I emptied my magazine into its flank, but it barely flinched. As I fumbled to reload, it lunged at me, and I was certain I was about to meet the same fate as Carter. But then Alvarez was there, thrusting something into the creature's side. It let out an ear-piercing howl and reared back, giving us a moment to regroup. That's when I saw what Alvarez was holding, a silver dagger he'd bought from the local market weeks ago. The creature's reaction to the blade was immediate. Black blood oozed from the wound, and it thrashed wildly, howling in agony. "Now," I shouted, and we opened fire again. This time our shots seemed to find their mark. With a final, bone-chilling roar, the beast collapsed, its massive body twitching before falling still. For a long moment, we just stood there, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. "What the hell was that?" Thompson finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. None of us had an answer. It looked like a wolf, but it was far too large, easily the size of a grizzly bear, and no natural animal could have withstood that much gunfire. A pain groan snapped us back to reality. Carter. In the chaos, I'd almost forgotten about him. We rushed to his side, but it was clear he was in bad shape. His torso was a mess of blood and torn flesh. "Hang in there, man," I said, applying pressure to the worst of the wounds. "We're getting you out of here." But even as I said it, I knew it was hopeless. His eyes were already growing dim. He looked at each of us in turn, then whispered something I'll never forget. It wasn't supposed to be real. Those were his last words. He was gone before the medevac chopper arrived. The next few hours were a blur of debriefings and medical exams. We told our story over and over, but I could see the disbelief in our superiors' eyes. Hell, I could hardly believe it myself. When we returned to the site with a larger team, the creature's body was gone. Vanished. All that remained were blood-soaked leaves and the spent shell casings from our weapons. Carter's body was the only proof that anything had happened at all. The official report called it a bear attack. We were ordered not to discuss the incident with anyone. Part of me was relieved. Who would believe us anyway? But mostly I felt a deep, gnawing unease. What had we encountered out there? In the years since, I've spent countless hours researching folklore, cryptozoology, and even military experiments, trying to make sense of it. Was it some kind of mutant? A creature from local legends? Or something else entirely? I still don't have answers. All I know is that something impossible happened in those woods, something that defies explanation and haunts my dreams to this day. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear that unearthly howl echoing in the distance. And I can't help but wonder, are there more of those things out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to remind us that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than we ever imagined? I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what happened. But one thing's for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. And I'll always keep a silver blade close at hand, just in case. It began roughly a month after I returned home. Reintegrating into civilian life was harder than I'd anticipated. The nightmares were relentless, and sleep was a luxury I could barely afford. But what happened one night was different, something far beyond the usual terrors of my restless mind. I woke abruptly in the dead of night, my body completely immobilized. I couldn't move a muscle, not even to open my eyes. Panic surged through me as I realized I wasn't alone. There was a presence in the room, something palpable, something wrong. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Sleep paralysis, I told myself. I'd read about it, how the mind can conjure horrors during moments of vulnerability. But then, with immense effort, I managed to pry my eyes open. What I saw shattered any semblance of logic. A figure stood at the foot of my bed, impossibly tall and unnaturally thin. Its skin was a deep blood red, and its face, its face, it was a grotesque mockery of humanity, distorted features, eyes like bottomless voids, and a mouth filled with jagged teeth twisted into a horrifying grin. I tried to scream, to thrash, to do anything, but I was utterly frozen. The creature simply stood there, its gaze piercing through me as if it could see into the darkest corners of my soul. After what felt like an eternity, it began to fade, dissolving into the shadows. The moment it vanished, I bolted upright, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might explode. I told myself it was just a nightmare, a byproduct of my PTSD and exhaustion. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that. Each time, the entity grew bolder. Sometimes it stood silently, watching. Other times it whispered in a language I couldn't comprehend, its voice a guttural rasp that sent chills down my spine. The paralysis lasted longer with each encounter, and I waked feeling drained, as if something had siphoned the life from me. During the day, strange occurrences began to plague me. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut without explanation, and once I found every photograph in my apartment turned face down. The worst part was the constant sensation of being watched. I'd catch glimpses of a red face in mirrors or see shadows darting just beyond my peripheral vision. I was unraveling, my grip on reality slipping. Sleep became impossible and my appetite vanished. My friends noticed the change, but how could I explain what was happening? They'd think I was insane. Hell, I was starting to believe I was insane. 2 weeks into this waking nightmare, things took a terrifying turn. I woke to find the entity hovering over me, its face mere inches from mine. Its breath reeked of rotting flesh and sulfur, and its clawed hand reached out, pressing against my chest. The pain was excruciating, as if it were trying to claw its way into my heart. Somehow I broke free from the paralysis and scrambled out of bed, flipping on every light in the apartment. When I looked in the mirror, 3D crimson scratches marred my chest. That was the moment I knew I couldn't handle this alone. I'm not a religious man, but desperation drove me to seek help. The next day, I visited a small church in the heart of the city and asked to speak with a priest. That's how I met Father Elias, an elderly man with a gentle demeanor and an air of quiet strength. I poured out my story, expecting skepticism or even dismissal. Instead, he listened intently, his expression growing graver with each detail. When I finished, he leaned forward and said, "What you are describing sounds like a demonic entity, one that's latched onto you, feeding on your fear and trauma." Demons. The word felt absurd, but after everything I'd endured, I was willing to believe anything. Father Elias agreed to help. That night, he arrived at my apartment armed with holy water, a crucifix, and a resolve I hadn't anticipated. We set up in my bedroom, where the entity had appeared most frequently. As darkness fell, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the lights flickered ominously. That familiar sense of dread washed over me, heavier than ever. Father Elias began to pray, his voice steady and commanding. At first, nothing happened. Then the room erupted into chaos. Objects flew through the air, the walls seemed to bleed, and the stench of decay filled the space. The entity materialized, more solid and terrifying than before. Its red face contorted in rage as it let out an ear-splitting shriek. Father Elias's prayers grew louder, more fervent. The demon lunged at him, but he raised the crucifix, and the creature recoiled as it burned. What followed was a blur of pandemonium. The room became a maelstrom of flying debris, the walls oozing a dark, viscous liquid. The entity writhed and screamed, its form shifting in impossible ways. The air itself seemed to tear apart, and just when I thought I couldn't endure another moment, there was a blinding flash of light and a deafening boom. Silence followed. The entity was gone. The room was in shambles, but the oppressive presence had vanished. Father Elias slumped to the floor, exhausted but triumphant. "We've done it," he said. "The demon is banished." As we sat there, catching our breath, Father Elias turned to me with a solemn expression. "The entity is gone," he said, "but you must understand these things are drawn to guilt, to unresolved trauma. Your experiences have made you vulnerable." He urged me to seek help, to confront the memories and emotions I'd buried. And he warned me to remain vigilant. "Evil doesn't give up easily," he said. "It may try to find another way in." Years have passed since that night, and I haven't seen the red-faced entity again. But sometimes in the darkest hours, I still feel as though something is watching me. I've been working through my trauma, slowly finding peace with my past. It's a long, arduous journey, but I'm making progress. I don't know if anyone will believe this story. There are days I struggle to believe it myself, but I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I know there are forces in this world beyond our understanding. If you're reading this and facing something similar, don't wait as long as I did to seek help. And remember, the real demons aren't always the ones we can see. Sometimes they're the ones we carry inside us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Stay vigilant, stay strong, and never let your guard down.